Hello, my name is April and welcome to the Grant Template video series. In this video, we will cover the problem statement. So the problem statement is really about the central problem that your project addresses. And it can be a problem that is significant to a population, a problem of lack of capacity in an organization, your organization or another organization, a need for research or evaluation, or a mix of these problems. Good questions to ask, as simple as they may seem when we're coming up with problem statements and we're trying to figure out what problem we're really looking at, is first, why is it a problem? Very general, just why is it a problem? From there, we can go into to who is it a problem? What are the characteristics of this population? Any other issues the population may have? And this is important because if we tap into the context of the population, we might find low-hanging fruits that our project can easily address. And if we do that, if we include those extra things in our project will gain in richness, will become stronger, and it will be relatively easy and relatively low cost eventually for us to do some of these things. So these questions can lead us to a better design of our project as well. Another question is, in which context does the problem happen? Does it happen in a very specific context? How often does it happen? How widespread is it? And is it the same everywhere? This is really interesting to navigate while thinking about our problem because this can really help us create a more impactful grant if we think about the context and how far the problem is widespread and what can we do in our project, especially now in the age that we live in with the internet and with easy connections across the world and things that we can do that we can bring together regions that are far away. So it's really interesting to think about the nature of the problem and where it happens. Because if, for example, we are creating a new methodology to approach the problem, we can then share this as part of our grant with other regions, other people that are having the problem, and now they can go ahead and test it in their own contexts, and maybe it can become a solution that can help everyone in every context, or it might need to change. But these things need to be taken into consideration while writing the grant because you want your grant to be aware of what's going on around the problem. When you write the grant, you want the reviewer, you want everyone involved with you to understand that you are aware of the dimension of the problem. So this is where these questions can also help you translate that awareness that you have into the pages of your grant. Another good question is, what is the nature of the problem? Is it a financial problem? Is it a problem of lack of access, lack of capacity, lack of knowledge? And this is important because it's going to tie up to what you're going to present as a solution in the rest of your grant. So yes, we're still in the problem statement. We're really just talking about the problem, but the way we look at the problem and the amount of information that we can gather around the problem, that will help us shape the rest of the grant. So it's really important to do this sort of extra thinking around the problem. And different from a research study, a grant has sort of this expectation to go a little bit beyond maybe one hypothesis, for example, right? Like in a research project, you might be very focused and you might look at this one thing and it might be a great research project. But in a grant, if you look at one thing and there's something that is really close to that is also a problem, and you just don't even mention it, reviewers might feel you are not really understanding the problem you're dealing with and you're not really working for the benefit of society or for the benefit of solving really that problem at its core. So it's important to really go around and go the extra mile when thinking about the problem and creating your problem statement. And we're going to go into more detail about this. So characteristics of a problem statement. It has to be objective and to the point. It's really a central point of the grant project. The entire project seeks to respond to the problem expressed in the problem statement. So if you don't express your problem well, the reviewer will not really understand why you are proposing what you are proposing. So you need to be sure that the reviewer understands, okay, this is the problem, and then the reviewer will find it really easy to support your solutions. They will agree with you. They will think, oh, of course, if that's the problem, this is a great solution. And then, of course, they will start reviewing the quality of your solution, and we will get to that in other videos. But the idea here is how important the problem statement is for the rest of the grant. Another important characteristic is clarity and irrefutable evidence is essential. And these are qualities that will bring reviewers to your side. Because again, when they agree with you that the problem is important and the problem needs to be solved, they are much more likely to support your solutions to this problem. So clarity, it's paramount. You got to really be able to express things in a way that non-academics will understand, and it will be really easy to grasp the importance and why it's a problem and how it's a problem and all of that. And the idea of irrefutable evidence is essentially evidence that comes from a really strong source, and it's basically not questionable evidence. So for example, if 50% of students are not graduating on time, that is not questionable. It's just a fact. They are just not graduating on time. It's 50%. You have that number. Those kinds of evidence are really strong in grants. Of course, you want also to have the freedom to go and get evidence from a bunch of other sources, including research studies, including even maybe experiences of participants depending on the project. You can broaden the amount of evidence you bring to support your problem, of course, but it's good to have some irrefutable evidence in there as much as possible so that the reviewer does not have to question your evidence. You can get that part out of the way, and they can simply agree with you, and then you and the reviewers together can just move forward into the solution that you're providing. So you're through the problem, they understand the problem, and you're guiding them through your grant. And then another characteristic of the problem statement that is really important is that it's typically the opening text of your project. Unless, of course, requested otherwise, in grants, essential rule is to follow the guidelines in the solicitations, in the opportunities. So, of course, when they send us a list of what they want, maybe our problem statement is divided into little bits, or it shows up as a third point, etc. That's fine. But usually it's the opening of the grant. So you want to have the buy-in of the reviewer right there in that first moment, in that first paragraph, in that second paragraph. You want to get the reviewer to agree with you right there. If you start giving them a really long introduction to the problem, you might lose them. So the idea is that you give them a really strong problem statement, and then if you feel the need to elaborate, you can elaborate after that when they already understood the dimension and the importance of your problem. So get them, hook them, and then elaborate if you find necessary. But remember, the reviewer is not someone that is looking for the same things that you are. When we are invested in solving a problem, we might know a lot more about that problem than anyone else in the world, and we might be invested in a way that no one else is. And maybe the reviewer and maybe even the sponsor who's giving us money, they are happy with us solving one part of the problem, which is what we're proposing. So that sort of, those constraints of, hey, this is what I'm doing in this grant. I know this problem is a bigger problem, but hey, this is what I'm doing in this grant. It's important to keep that in mind as well, to be clear about what part of the problem we are addressing and then focus on that. And then that will help us understand if we really need to elaborate further on certain parts of the grant or not. And in many cases, less is more in grant making. Even though we see grants with 40 pages and a ton of words, it's still less is more. If we are going to elaborate, we're going to find things that are very meaningful and that really add to the project. But we're going to get into that in other videos as well. So going forward, another important point is the impact and the strength of the evidence that we bring in. And what is impact? An easy way to think of impact is it's the difference between the world with and without your project, right? So, for example, those 50% students that don't graduate on time, just following the same example, that's what the world without your project looks like. 50% of students don't graduate on time. Let's say you create some extra, a new program that comes in and gets those students to graduate on time, and you're very successful, and now you reduce that rate from 50% to 25%. So you got half of those students back on track and graduating on time, and that's a huge impact. Right? So that's the idea of impact, the world with and without your project. And how do we translate that in the problem statement? So again, thinking about the importance of impact, it's how impactful your problem statement is to the reviewer, how impactful the problem is to society as well. The reviewer will be able to get off their shoes and think about, how this impacts other communities as well. And the perception of impact will be affected by the strength of evidence. So in general terms, and I know as researchers, there's a common, understanding around the value of different data. I'm personally a big fan of qualitative data myself. I really enjoy qualitative research, and I have performed a lot of studies in using qualitative research. But when it comes to grants, there is sort of an expectation on the value of certain evidence, and for the better or for worse, it is what it is. I would say just, move forward in a pragmatic way over here, just look at it and think, okay, this is what it is. I'll try to get some of this, some of this, some of that. So for example, quantitative data, big numbers we usually have high value when it comes to defending a problem statement and defending actions in activities and grants. And this can be, experimental and quasi-experimental studies. It can be also general stats like we were talking about, and it can include mixed methods as well. Mixed methods is well accepted, and actually mixed methods is growing as even, perhaps the strongest method because of the qualitative depth and texture and how it brings it all together and it integrates all that different kind of data, and it gives a more realistic, a more real life view of the problem, which is what grants are all about. A lot of the grants that we work with, especially in education, if you're not in education and you're watching this video, we are in a college of education. So it's important to think about that idea of how many different components come into play in the work that we do. And mixed methods is very strong when working with those dynamic contexts and environments. So mixed methods very strong, but again, having that big data. Then the second strongest is still having quantitative, smaller numbers, less data, and then qualitative. And then the least value is anecdotal and personal experiences. Now, that can't be can't be left aside entirely, because the personal experience will count in many ways, including, for example, when you're talking about the strength of your team or the people that you're selecting to bring into your project. Personal experience and life experience will count in that sense, and it may count in other parts of your project as well. This is just a general rule of thumb when thinking about what kind of evidence do I want to bring to the grant. So, effective problem statements, and this is where we start getting into the practical side of creating the problem statement. And a good exercise that I would recommend, that I think all of us, should do for every project, every research project or grant that we're working on, is just think if we can express the problem and also give evidence in one sentence, just as an exercise of how succinct we can be and how to the point we can be. So it's a good exercise. I would recommend you doing it. A few examples here are, for example, in a region, they have a persistent teacher shortage of 2,000 open positions a year due to X, Y, Z problems, but the region only graduates 800 teachers a year, and that's a problem in itself. So we see a difference in numbers there. We have some problems happening. The persistence is something that will naturally be addressed and elaborated later, but here we have a short sentence that captures the attention of the reviewer and lets the reviewer understand already that, okay, we're talking about teacher shortage, we're talking about a persistent problem, we're talking about capacity. The reviewer is already understanding all these things in this one sentence. So another example, lack of access to educational resources is keeping over 50% of students in low-income communities in a city from completing school and entering the workforce in qualified positions. So here again, it's very clear. We gave them a clear statistics. Naturally, we would have evidence for that. We would have, a reliable source for all of that. But the reviewer already understands that there's a lack of access, there's a lack of, educational resources, and there's a lack of, career progression, and essentially a problem that persists on the, maybe the poverty, maybe the, unqualified job market. These problems are persisting partially because of what's happening with the lack of educational resources. So you're addressing something that will eventually branch out into other problems, and you're going to elaborate on that later. But here, the reviewer already understands that the lack of educational resources or the lack of access is a problem, and it's the problem you're going to look at in your grant. Another example, over 60% of legislators in a region use less research-based information than they would like due to the lack of time to read complex academic publications. Now, this is a really interesting problem, especially when we are in the academic field and we're like, how come? How can they not have time, right? But it might be actually, very close to the truth. People that are extremely busy, overscheduled, they don't have time to go through 15 pages of, academic text to understand maybe a finding and then have to think for themselves in how to apply that finding to the decision-making process that they are having in their work. So what we're saying here is that there is sort of a disconnect between what the legislators need and what the academic group is providing to them, right? So that's essentially what our project would be looking at, and it already gives the reviewer a good idea of the problem and what the project will be looking at. So these are just examples. I highly recommend you to exercise that within your grant project. So another really cool idea that we spoke about briefly is the idea of tying the problem statement to the rest of the project. So while we of course, can elaborate more into how the problem statement ties into the project throughout, the grant. It's good that in the problem statement itself, in the succinct version, in the first paragraph or in the second paragraph, we can already add other little problems that are associated to the bigger problem that we are going to address later with the activities in our grant. So an example of that, taking the previous example of the lack of access of the students to, so imagining that lack of access to education resources is keeping over 30% of students in low-income communities from completing school and entering the workforce in qualified positions. So the project towards that, the project will create, this is just an example, a library partnership on the resources and will give them transportation. So essentially, the project will offer people free transportation to the library, and in the library there will be a special project going on where they will have a lot of access to a lot of educational resources that they need to complete school, to get ahead, and to get qualified jobs. So it's a library project. It sounds really cool in itself. But what else is going on that you're also going to include in your project because it's a low-hanging fruit, because it's easy, because it's low cost, and it's also associated with the problem. So for example, additionally, they also lack technology skills. So then you include in your activities, a technology skills workshop. And in their problem statement, you might say, finally, they lack perspective of the job market. So they don't even know what kind of jobs are out there. So in your project, you will create an activity of a job preparation workshop. So on the left column here, we have the problem statement, and we have 2 or 3 other sentences that are little problem statements of like little additional problems that are associated to the bigger problem and would be easy for you in your project to address as well. You're already giving them transportation to the library. You already got a partnership with the library where you have the space that you need. All you need is maybe some experts to come in and give this population some extra training. Might be easy, might fit well into the budget. Why not do it? Will make your project be stronger. That's the kind of mindset around this process. So finally, we're reaching the end of this video. Some references to creating a good problem statement. So we got to think every time, what is a good problem statement for a specific opportunity, or if we are creating what I call a spontaneous project, right? Let's just say we have a lot of things that are happening around us. We're part of a community, or we're already, working within a context of several nonprofits. We're seeing the problem happen. We don't know if there is a solicitation out there or not, but we know we want to address it. We can also create grant projects that are spontaneous, and then we go out looking for funders that match as well, which is not a bad strategy. But in general, we want to hone in on what the opportunity is asking for. So where can we look? What are the references that we can look to answer those questions that we have and to be relevant with our project? So first of all, of course, the funding agency materials, right? So if we're gonna submit a grant to a certain funding agency, then we really want to understand their mission, their vision, what they are all about, their current solicitations, so what's open. It's really good to understand. So if they're looking for, a lot of things around education, they are very oriented towards education. And if you have an education project, they will likely enjoy taking a look at it. And you also want to look at the past awards just to see what they have funded, if that has changed, and understand like their sort of habits in a way, of funding certain projects. They might look for certain kinds of evidence. A foundation that's very specific is WT Grant. They like certain specific kinds of methodologies, for example, and you'll only learn that if you look into what they have funded and things like that. So it's really important to look into the funding agency materials and think of yourself as a partner that is just starting a partnership with them. Even though they haven't funded you yet, as soon as they do, that's what it is. You are essentially working with them to spend those funds in a way that also moves their interests forward. So you're together moving forward. Another good source for problem statement references is political level data. So that's statistical data, programs at the political level. So for example, what is the city doing that in relation to the problem that you're thinking about? What is the state doing? What is the nation doing? What is the United Nations doing? What is the world doing in relation to the problem that you're thinking about? And then look also for current hot topics that are up for debate and for decision, because there might be a lot of funding, usually that happens in the political level, around issues that are up for debate, and people are trying to sometimes show that something works or prove that something is beneficial, and there might be an opportunity there for you to come in and get one project funded that will support a certain perspective within that debate. So political level data, good place to look for references. Then, of course, scientific level data, the current research, applied sciences, right? Like where, like in education, what's happening in the classroom, what's happening in the new schools, what's happening in online certification, what's happening in, budgeting for big institutions, that kind of thing, and thinking of it in a scientific level as well. And then also thinking in informal settings, that can be also helpful to understand the formal, the institutional, but what happens in informal settings, is the relationship with the community going, is it helpful or not? Is that an area you might want to work with? Is that where you want to focus your project? So scientific level data can be very important as well, especially if you're creating a project that is a research project. Even though in the grants universe, I would say the minority of projects in social sciences and education are really research projects. You get a lot of research in medical fields, engineering, and in education, you get a little bit of research, and you get a lot of projects that are programs that are moving forward, students that are more like actually about applying the science, applying the education expertise to move society forward in many ways. So there's a lot of that idea of, using scientific level data to advance knowledge or to create a broader impact. And these are NSF terms that you will become familiar with and are important terms to think about too. And then finally, what is close to you specifically? Your network, your affiliations, your connections, your community that you collaborate with. What is really close to you that can really add strength to your project? And then because you are part of the project, your connections and expertise are expected to count towards specific activities and outcomes. Hence, the proximity of the problem to you is a positive factor to reviewers. So problems that are really close to your expertise are good problems for you to write about, propose a grant about, and be involved with. And another idea is if you feel at any point that you need to grow into different expertise or you need to grow into a different sort of area, a good way to do that, when you're already established in the professional level, is to collaborate with maybe another principal investigator. You become a co-investigator in their study, and now you're branching out into a slightly different field that you haven't done a lot of work before, but now you're in a grant with because your expertise is beneficial to that. And then after that, you could be a principal investigator to look into something similar to that. So this collaboration environment is really a positive way to move around in the grant world, trying to find these collaborations, other academics, even with nonprofits that are looking into problems that require funding, and your expertise can be beneficial, but maybe you would not be the principal investigator, but it would get you that experience so that in the next project you would be the principal investigator. But of course, if you are looking into being the PI, then the closer to your expertise, the better. And that's it for this video. These videos are a little bit longer. This is the first video in this series, so thank you for staying with me. And we're going to look into detail in a lot of other aspects of grant making, and we'll cover what we are calling a grant template video series. Thank you for staying with me, and I'll see you in the next video.